Oh, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to the book club in the Silver Sirens Virtual Sanctuary. And today we have the honor of having beautiful Tracey Spicer with us to talk us through a phenomenal book, Man-Made. And I would like to say before we go that I had the pleasure of being writing one of the cover notes in this book. So what an honor. Thank you so much, Tracey. Over to you.
Oh, Faith, thank you so much for reading my book early. You were one of the first people to read it because I'm such an admirer of you and your work, and for writing such beautiful words. I love your community. Thank you all for coming along tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm joining you from today, the lands of the Camaragal people, and to pay my deep respects to their elders past and present, and those wonderful new young leaders who are coming through right now. For those of you who are joining us, if you'd like to put in the chat box the lands that you're joining us from today, that would be terrific as well. One piece of scholarship that I uncovered while researching this book, which took about 7 years, is that, believe it or not, Australia's First Nations women are the world's first computer coders. Because when you think about computer code, it's a binary code of zeros and ones, which is really similar to weaving with the warp going over and under the weft, and knitting with knit one, purl two. So even though we think about IT and the IT guy, the archetypal image that we see around us these days, women and people in marginalised communities are deeply embedded in the history of computing. So what I'd like to talk about over the next, probably 15, 20 minutes or so, and then I'd love to hear questions from you and broaden it out into a conversation, is how I came up with the idea for the book Man-Made, where the journey took me and where we are now when it comes to artificial intelligence. I promise I'll talk in layperson's terms because honestly, I'm not a technologist. I'm merely a humble journalist. And the greatest challenge of writing this book was to take the really pointy-headed techie language and put it into layperson's terms so anyone could pick up the book and understand what I was going on about. I got the idea 7 years ago when my then 11-year-old son turned to me over breakfast one morning. I'm making Vegemite on toast. I'm wiping sleep out of my eyes, not at the same time, I can assure you. That would be highly unhygienic. And he said to me, "Mum, I want a robot slave." I said, "Darling, what are you talking about?" Anyway, in an appalling moment of parenting, my husband and I had allowed our children at a very young age to watch the adult cartoon series South Park. We wanted to sleep in, right? Terrible parenting. In this one episode that our son watched, Cartman, a very naughty boy, was ordering around his Amazon Alexa like he was some kind of colonial master. And as a lifelong feminist and journalist, I had an epiphany that this idea of women and girls being servile in the home is being embedded into the machines that will run our futures. After a little bit of digging, I realised that this was deliberate on behalf of the tech giants. They took the ideas for their devices to focus groups, and because historically society is comfortable with women being servile around the home and in society, and with men being authoritative in the workforce, they wanted male voices for the chatbots in the business and finance sector and female voices for the chatbots in our homes. I dug even deeper to discover that it wasn't only sexism and misogyny. There was a very famous example that went viral around the world on Twitter when a Nigerian tech worker went into a Marriott hotel and tried to use the automated soap dispenser. Now, the soap dispenser was powered by AI and it was a light sensor, so the light would come down from the soap dispenser, bounce off the hand and go back up to activate it. It wouldn't work for his hands, but it worked for the hands of his white colleague and for a white piece of paper. Now, that is horrifying enough to think about that in the development of a soap dispenser, but consider this. That same AI light sensor technology is used in self-driving cars, which to this day can come to a pedestrian crossing, and if there's a person of colour there, they may well be run over. The car will not stop. Now, the reason this happens is because we think about big tech as being big. And they are. A lot of the companies have profit margins larger than the GDPs of nation states. But every team making the innovations is quite small. So in the case of the automated soap dispenser, it was a group of young white guys in Silicon Valley who simply did not think to test the device on anyone outside of their homogenized group of friends before distributing it around the world. I mean, if that's not privilege, I don't know what is, right? As I did some more research, I realized that the embedding of this bias into artificial intelligence is a three-step process. It starts with the data. Now, before writing this book, I had no idea what data was. I pretended I knew what it was, but I did not. Basically, data is just a big pile of images and videos and words that you can find on the internet. Inevitably, any data used to train a machine is historical because it's from the past. So inevitably, every doctor will be a male and every nurse will be a female. It will default towards able-bodied, city-dwelling instead of rural or regional. It will lean towards heterosexual, younger, which is outrageous. I'll tell you some stories about that later, white and male. So that's the homogenized view of data. Then that goes in to create the algorithm, and the programmer, who is predominantly a young white man, puts his own unconscious bias into the algorithm. A lot of people describe algorithms as mathematical equations, but two people I interviewed for the book said algorithms are opinions expressed in code about the way the programmer thinks the world should work. Now, that's frightening. The third step is through machine learning, and I describe machine learning as like a white supremacist going down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory websites. The machine takes those early biases and deepens them. A classic example happened in 2016, and you might have read about this one. Microsoft put what they called a millennial-minded chatbot on Twitter, whatever that is. And it was supposed to have the characteristics of a young, fun 19-year-old girl. Well, within 24 hours of Tay, the 19-year-old girl chatbot being on Twitter, she became an anti-feminist neo-Nazi because she hoovered up all of the nasty interactions on Twitter and exaggerated them. That's what machine learning does. One of the greatest leading lights in this area, and I'd highly recommend you follow her, is Dr. Joy Buolamwini. She runs an organization called the Algorithmic Justice League, which sounds like a bunch of superheroes because they are. Several years ago, as a technologist at MIT, which is probably the greatest technology institute in the world, she was trying to create this mirror where people could hold it up to their faces and have someone they admired reflected back to them. She wanted to have an image of Serena Williams reflected back at her. The technology she created was working really well, but when she moved her head and moved the mirror, there was something a little bit off, and she wanted it to be a seamless experience. So she bought some software off the shelf to add to her innovation. The next time she put the mirror up to her face, guess what? It didn't identify her as human until she put on a white mask. Now, we know that in things like if you apply for a job, or if you apply for a home loan or a credit card, if you are a woman or a person of colour, you are less likely to get those things because historically we have had fewer roles in the workplace and we're less likely to get home loans. And those patterns from the past are being reflected in the future. It's almost like reawakening a zombie. And that is infuriating. In fact, in the US, they've seen the rate of what they call Black home ownership go backwards, go downhill ever since algorithms have been making the decision about who gets a home loan or not. And as Dr. Joy Buolamwini says, that's infuriating to miss out on a job or to miss out on a home loan because of an algorithm. But for an algorithm to not even identify you as human, that is another level altogether. I spent much of last year in bed or a wheelchair with long COVID. So part of my book at the end deals with the health sector and artificial intelligence. Because one thing that I do make clear early in the book is that we may not realize it, but we're surrounded by AI from the moment we get up in the morning until the time our heads hit the pillow at night. Every time we do online shopping and they suggest a substitution, that's artificial intelligence. Every time we get on Netflix and it suggests a show we might like compared with what we've watched in the past, that's artificial intelligence. It surrounds us. Every time you go into a city and go into one of those smart elevators, that's AI as well. But in the healthcare sector, the use of it has exploded during the pandemic because so many nurses and doctors were sick that they had to rely on the technology instead. The problem with that is that they used what's called Frankenstein data sets. They cobbled together data from a whole bunch of different sources that didn't necessarily reflect the people that they were serving, the people in hospital, predominantly those who are older. So let's talk about some examples of ageism. If any of us in this conversation tonight go to a hospital and there's one ventilator and we're sitting next to a 30-year-old, the 30-year-old will get the ventilator in 100% of cases because the algorithm views them as more valuable to society and more productive than we are as people over 50. I frankly was horrified when I found out about that. There's this, what would you call it, vicious circle that happens with technology. Because the sector is full of young people who are so-called digital natives, they're creating a lot of technology that's used by older people that's almost impossible to navigate. My sister and I bought not a smartphone, a very old-fashioned phone for our 83-year-old father the other day because he simply couldn't use the smarter phone we'd tried to buy him with the arthritis in his fingers. This one had bigger buttons, but it was still too complicated for him to use. And that is a classic example. Now, the way it becomes a vicious circle is when all of us use social media and technology, we are putting into the internet our likes, our dislikes, our interests, our opinions, our demographic, our personality, our community, let's face it. And that data goes on to shape the next wave of devices and innovations. Now, if we're being effectively forced out of using technology because it's unusable or difficult or our needs and wants aren't considered, then we aren't being considered at all in any of the innovations, particularly in medical technology that could actually save our lives. Having said that, AI is phenomenal in the health sector and life-saving. Did you know that there's an app that can tell you whether you're going to get breast cancer in the next 5 years, even if you don't have symptoms? It's called Mirai, and it was created by a female technologist who had breast cancer. And she quit the company she was working with, one of the tech giants, and said, you guys are creating these crazy games that, yeah, they're fun, but they're not saving lives. I want to do something worthwhile. During the pandemic in New York City, they sent out aged care robots into the homes of people with dementia and Alzheimer's to tell them stories and ask them questions to keep them engaged. There is incredible work being done with AI in the area of neurodiversity. Because AI can look at patterns, it's identifying kids who are on the spectrum much earlier than they would have been previously. So I don't want it to sound like my book is all doom and gloom. There are positives and there are negatives. One area that I was quite horrified about while researching, and I want to give a trigger warning here because it's a very serious issue, obviously, is that of coercive control. When I spoke to people who worked in women's shelters, they said in 99% of cases at the moment when it comes to stalking or domestic abuse or sexual harassment or assault, technology is used, particularly artificial intelligence. If any of you have those Apple AirTags that you put on your luggage or your handbag, throw it away. They've improved them in the last couple of months, but they are classic devices that are used for stalking because they're so easy. What happens is this. Often there's a partnership in a household, and more often than not, the man is the one who sets up the smart home technology, whether that's just your Siri or whether it's your smart fridge. The relationship breaks down, the man leaves the house, but he can still control the technology externally. And he can gaslight the woman, turning the lights on and off in the middle of the night. Music comes on unexpectedly, the air conditioning goes to freezing, and the woman thinks, oh my gosh, I'm going crazy. But no, it's this guy controlling the technology from outside the house. The sufferers of what's called tech-facilitated coercive control or tech-facilitated abuse say it's akin to that old movie, The Amityville Horror. They feel like the house is alive and it's turned on them. In fact, one of the world's first prosecutions for tech-facilitated coercive control happened in Tasmania, in Australia. There was a guy who had helped his girlfriend buy her car, and he knew the VIN number. He knew how to set up the technology in it. When they broke up, he stalked her. He actually amassed weapons, which is terrifying. But more than that, he had the power to stop or start her car remotely. He could have stopped the moving vehicle. It went to court. He was convicted. Guess what he got? 2 weeks community service. We are at the very nascent area of understanding tech-facilitated abuse and proving it. Another area that was really thorny that I looked at in this book is that of sex robots. Look, part of it's quite funny, part of it's quite scary. I'll tell you the funny bit first to lighten the mood. I realised that 99% of sex robots are in the female form because of the whole idea of the Madonna whore dichotomy. You know, these robots are being created as either carers or lovers. I found one male sex robot, though, called Henry. Now, Henry has a penis that's so strong, it can lift up a truck. I don't know why it needs to be that strong or who tested that. How do you test that? I don't know. I read an interview with Henry's maker, Matt McMullen from Real Doll X, and he said, look, Henry is in his nascent stages. He said, Henry's so strong, if you go to bed with him, he could rip your head off. So I don't know about you, but I don't want to be the first person to be decapitated by a sex robot. I did very deep research for this book, but not that deep, I'm telling you. On a more serious note, and the female sex robots, there's one called Roxy with triple X's, of course. Roxy can be programmed to be any persona you want. She can be mature Martha or frigid Farah or young Yoko, 18 and never been kissed. So if you're talking about stereotypes like Siri and Alexa and the chatbots of the 1950s, these sex robots are exactly like that, this kind of stereotype, like in Westworld, for those of you who've watched that series. The overwhelming problem, though, with Roxy and sex bots like her are that there's a button on them that men can press to override consent. Yes, these robots are designed specifically to be raped. And there's a huge legal and ethical area exploding globally at the moment about if someone rapes a sex robot, is that rape? Is it sexual assault? Is the robot a mass of metal and wires? Or because it's a representation of a human and a female body, is that a violation? Is that in fact rape? And can the person doing it be prosecuted? Or can the makers of the sex robots be prosecuted for making them specifically as a tool for rape? That's a really new emerging area. Another area that's not so emerging, and you might have experienced this, I'd love to hear about this when we start having a chat and opening it for questions, is around deep fakes. We often think about deep fakes as being Barack Obama or Donald Trump or, you know, the end of democracy because we can't trust what our politicians say anymore. The deep fakes are so real. The programmers can make them say anything. But did you know that 95% of deep fakes are pornographic? They can take your head or your body from any images that you put on social media, make a pornographic video out of it, and it's very, very hard to prove who did it or to prosecute them. It's a very, very difficult area. In fact, I had a friend's 60th birthday recently, and I got onto this AI app called 11, which does voice cloning. And I had a bit of fun. I got John F. Kennedy's voice and did a 60th birthday sort of speech for my friend in JFK's voice, which was a lot of fun. But when you think about how real that is, that it took me about 10 minutes, and I'm not very technologically adept, even though I've written a book about it, to put those words into JFK's mouth just by scraping his voice off the internet. You know, people can use free apps or apps that are $5 to basically steal your voice or your face or your body and make it do anything. There's some legislation now in the States, although I think it's voluntary, where anything created by artificial intelligence needs to be watermarked. But the problem is the US is beholden to a free market economy. And because they haven't made it mandatory, I don't think the tech giants are really going to listen. There's some good legislation in the EU called the EU AI Act that's out to the member states at the moment, and then they're reporting back on it before it is put into place. That provides a really great template for AI safety. There's also really wonderful legislation in New York where any company that uses artificial intelligence for hiring has to have what's called a bias audit every year, which is wonderful because you might do a bias audit. It's like the old gender pay gap audits, you know, it's similar to that. You might do it 1 year and everything's fine, but the next year, because of machine learning, there's more bias in there. So the problem is you've got to keep doing it. In Australia, I'm on a panel tomorrow with Assistant Minister Andrew Lee, who's really ahead of the pack. He's actually written a lot of books about artificial intelligence before it even became popular. So I think the government here will take some action and put some regulations in place. And when you think about it, Australia, being a small English-speaking country, is often where new technology is tested. So we could test it here in what's called a regulatory sandbox environment, where the device is tested on a small group of people to make sure it's safe and unbiased before it's unleashed on the general population. But you know what? I tend to approach this topic more from a civil society perspective, that yes, we need regulation and legislation, but there's a lot we can do within our homes and our workplaces and as consumers. For example, Uber has a terrible corporate culture. It's a little bit better than it used to be, but we know that they pay people less than a living wage. We know Uber drivers sleep in their cars. It's appalling. When Travis Kalanick, I've got a whole chapter on Uber actually, started the company, and this was really relatively in recent history, but he used some very terrible old 1980s corporate, I suppose, executive techniques where he'd send the execs off to strip clubs and lap dancing places, a practice that they used to call tits on Travis, you know, really appalling stuff. There's a female-run transport company called Sheba. So my thoughts are we should put our monies where our mouths are and support companies that are run by women, Indigenous people, people from marginalised communities. We can also change the voices of Siri and Alexa in our homes to a male voice. And we can also contact our local members and say, this is an issue that affects us all, because if we keep seeing the stereotyping of images like this in society, it will lead and continue the widening of the gap between rich and poor. Because what's happening now is you've got neo-colonialism. All of the capital and wealth in artificial intelligence is in places like Silicon Valley, held by a handful of billionaires. And the work is being done by people in the global south for either nothing in modern day slavery or next to nothing in being paid not a living wage. Here's a classic example of that. When I talked about the data being a whole pile of stuff scraped from the internet, one good way of helping to fix artificial intelligence is to clean the data. And there are data cleaning companies, and they do a great job. But a lot of the people they're using to clean the data are in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Kenya, and being paid $2 an hour. Now, this is the modern day salt mines. These people have to look through for hours every day horrific, violent, pornographic images in order to get them out of the data set. So it's dangerous work, it's psychologically unsafe, and it's paid next to nothing. And that is what I'm concerned about with this widening of the gap between rich and poor because of the bias and discrimination in AI. However, I'm going to finish in a moment and then we'll open it for questions. One thing I'm very excited about is the number of women like Dr. Joy Bulamwini and Dr. Katrina Wallace here in Australia, follow her as well, who are fighting the good fight. Because as well as Australia's First Nations women, women have dominated the history of computing. Did you know in the 1950s, there were more women than men in computing? In fact, the world's first computer programmer was Ada Lovelace, the daughter of Lord Byron. Then there was Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, who came up with the most easy to understand computing language, COBOL, in the 1950s. We're living in a time now where we are finally remembering and celebrating her story as well as his story. So I invite you to join me in a movement to create a future that's fair for all of us, that's human-made, not man-made.
Thank you, Tracey. I'm going to just jump on the information you gave about more women than men being in computers. How did that change?
Oh, this is a horrifying story. You know, women, and there was a woman called the Rope Mother, Margaret Hamilton, and she led a team, this will make you laugh, of women with their tiny fingers who could weave the intricate matrices that allowed the Apollo mission to go into space. Those women were called the acronym LOL, Little Old Ladies. Can you believe it? And yet, when money came into the sector in probably the late 1960s, all the women were forced out and the men came in because they could see that there was money to be made in this sector. And all of those incredible things the women did in the 1950s, the ENIAC girls climbing in and out of huge computers to fix them, they were not named, they were not remembered. When there were beautiful events at the universities to celebrate innovation, they weren't invited. They have been lost to history until now. And it was all because of money.
And so that, as we say, follow the money. It's always about the money.
That's right. Follow the money to see where the power is. You're absolutely right, Faith.
Yeah.
Now, yes. Now, I see there's some questions there, but I'll leave the moderation in your capable hands, Faith, because you've done this more often than I have.
Let me just open it up. So anyone want to say anything? Because there are things in the chat, but that's more comments. Anyone want to jump in and ask Tracey a question or just comment on what Tracey has said? Now, I don't know if we're going to hear you, Cleo. I know that you...
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah,
okay. I can't hear you, but I can very, very faintly hear.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's such a fascinating topic. And I think one of the big, massive concerns that I'm sure we all share is something that has such a massive effect on culture is being controlled by corporations, tech corporations, whose only responsibility is to shareholders to make money. So the idea that something that, Elon Musk has said, no one's, this juggernaut has potential to do harm. And I feel very powerless. And I feel that, I'm kind of saddened when I go to even just something as basic, nowhere near as sophisticated as what, Tracey's been talking about. And I see everybody at the machine at the supermarket marking that, losing that human interaction, even at that very basic net level, and then many more sophisticated ways. And I wonder where this machine-led future is leading us. It spooks me in my gut. I feel scared, and maybe that's just my function as an older person, that I'm from a pre-digital age. I'm not a digital native, so maybe that's just normal for someone my age. But one of the things that really concerns me is it feels like our humanity is going to warp and shift forever in a direction that I don't understand. And the other thing that really concerns me is, as a creative person, we were talking before about what happens in the world of porn as something that's a violation. But also Stephen Fry mentioned that without anybody asking him, they downloaded all of the Harry Potter books, and they had got, enough vocabulary from those that he famously narrated to start using his voice commercially without hiring him as an actor. Just things like that show you where this is going. And I guess the feeling I'm having is powerlessness in the face. The same with climate change, you know, all these things that are going to have this profound effect on us, body, mind, spirit. What control do we have? You know, and obviously this is, you know, since artificial intelligence was created, we've always, you know, it's become the potential next monster. And I know that I use it. I'm probably using it right now with Zoom, you know, but I'm kind of starting to yearn for those analog assurances. So for me, I'm actually feeling quite spooked by this.
Cleo, you've articulated that beautifully, and there's a couple of threads there. The first one being the corporations. Interestingly, the term artificial intelligence was coined by a group of 10 white men in America in 1956 at the Dartmouth Conference. And there was never any discussion at that conference about the effect on humanity. It was sponsored by corporations, and it was all about making business money. So that's the roots of the technology, which continue to this day. With regards to looking to the future and feeling powerless, yes, I feel exactly the same way as you. And it's very similar to the existential threat posed by climate change. That's why I think small actions can feel really powerful. Even things like, you know, having a break from technology, refusing to support the companies that are the worst offenders, because then you feel like you've got a little bit of power over it. Ultimately, though, I'm a glass half full kind of gal, because this is the fourth industrial revolution. We've lived through the other three. And if you look at history, during each of those revolutions, for example, when the printing press came out, people said, all of those books, that'll be the end of society. People will be too busy reading to go to work or to do anything. And then when the wireless radio came out in 1927, everyone said, that'll be the end of family life. No one will sit around the dinner table anymore. So I do think it is right to be afraid. There is a 1 in 10 chance that AI will end humanity. That's what all the experts say. That's what even governments say. So it is an existential threat. But humanity has always forged forward. And I like to try to be optimistic, because we just need to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Anne. You want to unmute yourself, Anne, or you would like me to unmute you?
Okay, am I unmuted now?
You are.
Well, first of all, Tracey, I'd like to congratulate you on an amazing and the scariest book that I have ever read, actually. I did wonder how long it had taken you to write it. So 7 years, because there's a lot of research in there. It was very impressive. Now, on the micro level, I was reading your book, and it was about the point where organizations were disadvantaging women in various ways, you know, housing loans and so on. And just on that day, there was a news item in the Commonwealth Bank was getting rid of a lot of their staff and automating things like housing loans and credit facilities and so on. And so I'm one of these people that writes letters to the Herald. I wrote a letter actually saying, are they doing something to make sure that it doesn't discriminate against women? That letter didn't get up, of course, but I mean, it's already happening. You know, I'm sure that sort of situation is already happening. That's on the micro level. On the macro level, I just wanted to say that your chapter on war and you know, is absolutely the most frightening thing, because when you see what's happening in the world now, I have no confidence at all in the sanity and the, you know, because it's male dominated, and they only have one answer to this sort of thing, and that is fighting and, you know, trying to win battles and so on, which is a real worry. So I'm also a glass half full. I'm very much an optimist and a glass half full person, but I'm finding it extremely difficult when I'm thinking about the children, the grandchildren, you know, the younger generations, and what's ahead of them is quite frightening. And one thing that I don't think that you mentioned, but I was reading the book very quickly, was not only sort of are there, you know, sophisticated weaponry and what have you, but with very simple, presumably AI techniques, whole cities can be shut down. You can, you know, destroy a country without doing anything, without, you know, invading it or whatever. It just, you can cut off its water, cut off its electricity, cut off whatever, and bingo. So, you know, I'm wondering how you can retain any kind of optimism in the face of that kind of scenario, knowing what men are like, and knowing that women, even though, you know, it's good to see that they're in there, they're not in that whole area at all.
I totally hear you, Anne. Thank you for your pertinent insights. Thank you for reading my book. The area of warfare is genuinely frightening, because that 1 in 10 figure That's when AI intersects with warfare, with climate change, and with infrastructure. And things, as you say, cities, countries can be shut down overnight. One of the really interesting and frightening aspects of the warfare piece that I do write about in my book is that because the algorithms view women and people in marginalised communities as lesser humans than white men, in the case of warfare, and experts have told me this is not my extrapolation, drones could actually, in a war zone, hunt down women and children who are civilians because they view them as less valuable than the men on the ground. And in search and rescue missions, which robots are being trained to use, of course, which, you know, because I suppose in some ways it's safer than sending humans in. If a woman, for example, is wearing a hijab and her face is partially obscured, through facial recognition technology, the robot might have trouble identifying her as a human. She might be left behind. So there's all these really gnarly areas where it's hugely problematic and very, very scary. On what you said about the Commonwealth Bank, I read that article too, and I was going to write a letter to the Herald. Bloody horrified by that. I gave a speech in at the Commonwealth Bank at their Women in Focus series a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of the people in there were in the departments that are looking after those algorithms. So I know that they're aware of the bias. I know that they do audits for bias, which is great. I don't know how often they do them. And the other problem is those audits that are happening in New York, they only do it for gender and race. They don't do it for age. They don't do it for sexuality. They don't do it for disability or anything like that. So there's a long way to go.
Thank you.
So we're going to go to Susan Jarvis next. You ready?
Had to find my microphone. Hi, Tracey. This is absolutely wonderful.
Lovely to see you.
Thank you for joining us today. I haven't read your book yet, but it's waiting for me on the hold system through Brisbane City Library. So
wonderful.
You are in demand, okay? Firstly, God, I hope this goes global, your story in your book. I'm listening to what Cleo was saying. Everything Cleo was saying about being fearful resonates with me as well. Same with what Anne was saying. A few things that I wanted to just put out there, not so much as a question or just thoughts for the group. I really feel, I just wonder how different AI would be if it was women in control, because our decision-making and thought processes are so heart-centered around care and empathy for others, as opposed to that money focus. So it's just like my theory about what it would be. The bias testing, I would love to see that legislated here in Australia, well, not just banking, but for employment. Like I'm currently working in state government here in Brisbane, and I can't help but notice the department that I'm in is very, very bland, very homogenised, and there's not much diversity at all. So to have that, reporting on there, so I'm sure that there are some mechanisms in place to capture their diversity, but to have a bias test, for financial, rental, all that sort of stuff. The other thing is, do you know, or are you working on putting together perhaps a 10-point plan that people in the community can work to instigate change and to become advocates to the government around having some legislation around AI?
That's a really good idea. And in fact, the epilogue of my book is all solutions.
Good.
Home, the workplace, regulation and legislation. The Federal Science and Industry Minister, Ed Husic, put out 2 discussion papers. They've come back now, and that's the basis he's using for legislation. A lot of the people I interviewed for the book, a lot of the Australians, were on roundtables with Ed Husic and put forward a lot of those solutions. I know in New South Wales, I went to the state parliament the other day and spoke to some of the independent MPs who are very interested in this kind of stuff because they're progressive. So things are happening in government, which is incredibly encouraging. And you're absolutely right. The reason why I write so much in the first 3 chapters of this book about the history of women in AI is because if that had have continued, we would have a very different world. We'd be looking towards a very different future.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a question about the Hollywood actors and screenwriters strike, and I really like this because I know there's something that's still going on. And I wondered if you could speak to that at all, because I know AI is a major part of the issue. Then this is a question from Sarah.
Yes, don't you love this? Look, this might be a little bit controversial to say, but I was in a taxi the other day and the guy was asking me, what's your book about? And I explained it to him and he laughed. He said, oh, yeah. He said, yeah, artificial intelligence, took all those manufacturing jobs and all of our taxi drivers' jobs with Uber, and none of you creative types cared about it. But now it's affecting your jobs. Now you're all on strike in Hollywood and marching in the streets. And I kind of see that it's impacted blue-collar communities for years and years and years, and not much was done. And now it's affecting white-collar communities. Everyone's up in arms, right? But having said that, what they have done in Hollywood is phenomenal, because the agreement they've reached with the producers is a really good template for all industries when it comes to watermarking stuff that's being used, that's created by artificial intelligence, when it comes to having to default to hiring a human first before you go to lean on AI. So what they've achieved out of that long strike was very, very worthwhile. Unfortunately, when it comes to copyright, it's still a really difficult area. For example, there's this thing, because I know there's some authors here in this group. I don't know whether you've jumped onto Books 3 to see if your work has been scraped for artificial intelligence. I got onto it and found out my first book, The Good Girl Stripped Bare, has been scraped. There's a court case that Sarah Silverman, the comedian in the US, is running with a few other people on copyright. We still don't have any kind of precedent, but hopefully we will have soon. It's also to do with the images. We created this image. The graphic designer chose to use artificial intelligence to create this image to start a conversation about what was happening in his industry. We used an app called Midjourney. Some of you might have used that, or Stable Diffusion, or Playground AI. There's a few of them. They are phenomenal technology. All you've got to do is type in a couple of words and it comes up with a unique image. But that image has been created by scraping billions of images from authentic creators and breaching their copyright. Now, interestingly, for the cover of this book, I wanted a picture of a strong robot woman looking to the future with concern, but hope. The image that came up, first of all, was a really sexualized gold robot with a tiny waist and massive breasts and long eyelashes batting her eyes to the camera. So this image generation piece is really problematic too, beyond the copyright issue. For example, an advocate by the name of Jeremy Davis typed in a couple of months ago, show me an image of a person with autism. In 148 cases, it came up with a man. So according to the algorithm, no women or girls experience autism. It was always a young man, always a white man. And interestingly, always looked depressed or distressed or upset. So it came at neurodiversity from a really negative deficit model. The image stuff is hugely problematic. And again, with the aging situation, it's like a friend of mine said a couple of years ago, she tried to find an emoji of a woman with grey hair, because she's got grey hair like me, and the only images it came up with were a woman with a grey bun who looked like she came out of a 1940s picture book. I mean, really?
Yeah, I love that you said that, because I put in looking for older women as well for some stuff on Silver Sirens, and I always got a group of older women with grey hair, bun, and a collar all the way up to here. And usually an apron. That was all. Thank you.
Hilarious.
Now, Sarah, did you still want to ask another question? So you're still muted?
I just want to say that I was really into TikTok for a while, and they have a lot of AI and the filters and all, you know, you can play around with all these things. But I actually discovered how to disrupt it just accidentally. And I thought that led on to finding out a whole lot of tech people that are disruptors of AI. And it's very interesting to see the reaction and the things. It's kind of like the resistance, you know. So I found some AI resistors, but the technology, the filters on Instagram and TikTok, you know, it's a big thing. They're really investigating it now because it's causing so much mental health issues with young people. But I found if you just wear your glasses, it disrupts the filter on your face, and then it started doing this thing like it was having a meltdown. The computer, the AI didn't like it and was flickering and shuddering, and I thought, this is so interesting. Anyway, I just thought that you, as creators, and that you might find that interesting.
Oh, I love that you found the disruptors on TikTok. That's brilliant, because
and Mastodon, I found them actually. All the people that left Twitter are a lot of creators and technical, like people that write games and codes and everything, and they're all like disruptors. It's fantastic.
Isn't that brilliant? And as you alluded, it's hugely problematic because we saw the photoshopping in magazines, and then we saw the Doris Day lenses in any kind of video content. And now AI is taking that to the next level, particularly on places like TikTok and Instagram that are predominantly aimed at young people. Thank you for those insights, Sarah. I was just looking at the comments in the chat box, and I don't know who wrote all the women code breakers in World War II. Yes, we must remember them. And one story I write about in my book is these wonderful older women in Belgium sitting by the rail lines, knitting all the messages in code and giving the knitted pieces to the Allies. What a wonderful part of history.
Oh, can I jump in with a comment there? You know, resistance has been so powerful across the centuries. When the slaves were so-called freed in the USA, one of their communication methods was to display their handmade quilts, which gave the passerby men who were either trying to pass without being detected or without being arrested for whatever reason, and the methods of becoming free men, and which train to get on and which route to take. So I'm a great believer in organized resistance. And I notice you're wearing an almost teal jacket there, my dear sister. Maybe we could disrupt. You know, we could have Disruption Day. Would have to just irritate these bots and things.
It's a great idea. I think we should collaborate and workshop some resistance ideas in the fine history of resistance throughout the centuries. I love that. Thank you.
Beautiful. So we've got time for one more question. Anyone got a burning desire? Anyone got something they want to share, or just a comment for Tracey? Underground Railway. So Rowena's talking about the Underground Railway. Did you want to go? So did you, Rowena and Chanel, either both of you want to go? Okay, so Chanel, it's over to you. It's your turn, Chanel.
When you were talking about Stephen Fry and his voice being used, it was happening a lot in the States where children's voices are being copied but through AI from just a few words they'd said, and their parents would get a ransom call saying we want $1 million. And sometimes parents would just think, okay, where is our child? Or they knew where their child was, they'd be like, oh, forget it, and then it would drop down to 50,000. But it is scary how quick they can just get their hands on things, on our voice, our pictures. It's so scary, but it is interesting. It's so interesting, all of this.
Thank you for bringing that up. It's horrifying they're using children's voices. But I guess when you think about that voice cloning technology, it's really easy. All you need is 2 to 3 minutes of someone's voice. And because kids are holding up phones to their faces and recording themselves and putting it publicly, it's so easy to be scraped. And we're in an AI arms race. If you talk to anyone in cybersecurity or in any kind of, real world, security forces, they just say we simply can't keep up, that the technology is moving too fast and the criminals are using it in such a sophisticated way that whatever regulation, legislation, or some punitive action they put in place, the criminals are always one step ahead. It's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, beautiful. Any final words? Okay, I'm gonna get. Oh, good, Tass. I was gonna come and ask you. So perfect. Go, Tass. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's really interesting that none of us in the room tonight are teenagers, obviously, about the different way or the view of much younger people around AI compared to our cohort. I have very much, I don't like change, I don't like that sort of change. I'll make this brief. I don't know if any of you have read Sapiens or Homo Deus. It's, Yuval Noah Harari, amazing. His view is that, I'm trying to find the talk, is that humans are evolving now very quickly, and the last humanoids as we know them, I think that his prediction was it was one generation or two away, because our brains will be so affected by and still biological brains, but so affected by our relationships with artificial, I guess, neighbours, the other people in the population. It'll be a serious thing, and I'm really glad I won't be around for it. Probably. It's just something that I like it how it is, So it's about the difference generational difference in the points of view around AI. I guess that's my question.
Yeah, Tass, I'm totally with you. There's a chapter in my book that centers on transhumanism, and that's basically where we become half human, half robot with implants in our body. And I see that Sarah has put in a comment about that, being worried about Elon Musk with the neurological implants. I was on a panel with Dr. Katrina Wallace yesterday, who's was on Shark Tank, one of Australia's great AI experts, and she said, we'll see neurological implants in the next couple of years. Like, that's very soon technology, and that's transhumanism. The interesting thing about the generational approach is that, Tass, you're horrified by that. I'm horrified by that. But then I think, oh, my phone's actually not here, that we're almost surgically attached to our phones anyway these days. And if you look at each younger generation, the younger they get, the more surgically attached they are to their phones. So it's inevitable that they'll be implanted into their hands. I don't know whether you've watched Black Mirror or Years and Years, wonderful dystopian futures that really focus on transhumanism. They do expect the singularity, where we do merge, will happen around 2050. So it is very, very soon. But you're right, I've got two teenagers, 17 and 18, and they're not concerned about that in the slightest. They'll be delighted to have technology implanted into their bodies. Equally, that generation, they're very good critical thinkers because they've lived with digital technologies for a long time. They know what the AI stuff is on Snapchat or on TikTok. They can see what the technology is trying to do to them. So what we need to do as a society is to move into a golden age of critical thinking, because that's the only way we'll get ahead of the machines.
Beautiful. That's a really great place to end, because I get quite disturbed by all the misinformation and how that's been normalized. So I think moving into a golden age of critical thinking is vital as a species. That's probably all that's going to save us. So thank you so much, Tracey. That was so beautiful, so thoughtful, so clear, so insightful. Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Faith. And thank you all for your incredibly intelligent questions and for being such a beautiful community. It's been a great joy. Thank you.
Thank you. I just stopped.